Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to one of our 3 short talks as part of the Strengthening Cyber Resilience Conference. As a reminder, we're going to be discussing how to protect societies against ransomware cyber attacks in this session. If you would like to join a short talk on gender and inclusion in cyber capacity building, that's going to be downstairs in the main plenary session. In that plenary session, there will be interpretation available, and it will be live streamed. So in case anybody would prefer to be in that session, because I know we're a little bit over capacity here, then they're going to be starting in about 5 minutes. So I'll just give everyone a couple minutes, just in case anybody thinks they might be in the wrong room. We won't take it personally. Before we get started, most importantly, Chris, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
And can everybody hear Chris okay as well?
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to one of our 3 short talks on how to protect societies against ransomware cyber attacks. I'm your chair, Isabella Wilkinson. I'm a research associate in cyber policy in the International Security Program at Chatham House. I'm also one of the conference organizers, so if you see me running around today looking a little bit stressed, that's why. But most importantly, I'm the chair for this short talk. Now, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our panel. With me in person today, I have Dr. Maria Bada, who is a lecturer in psychology at Queen Mary University of London and the author of a very exciting report, some of which will be on the side there and more of which are coming shortly, on ransomware, building on the Digital Access Program experience. Joining us virtually, we have Chris Painter, president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. So as I mentioned before, we won't be offering interpretation in this session today. This isn't going to be live streamed. However, with everybody's permission, I would like to record it so that we can send a recording and some notes and a summary to any colleagues that might not have been able to make it with us today. We are on the record, so you are highly encouraged to post and tweet about this all you like. Quotes can be attributed to speakers, and we will be running until 2, after which time we'll be heading into the workshops, the same groups that you were assigned to in the morning. There will be a little bit of time for Q&A. If I could politely request everybody to keep it short, introduce your name, your organization, your involvement in DAP, and then your question. So I won't spend too long introducing this topic, because I think protecting societies against ransomware cyber attacks has been a topic central to many participants' cyber capacity building expertise. But in this session, I want to hear from a couple experts about a central part of protecting societies against ransomware, which is effective partnerships and multi-stakeholderism. Whether these partnerships are forged across sectors, countries, borders, community groups, and I would argue this idea of effective partnerships has been a guiding theme and a guiding narrative of our conference so far. So I'd like to start by handing over to Maria, who has recently authored a paper along with Nathan Stoyer and Ravi Jayanti from KPMG, building on the experiences and expertise of many digital access program implementers on what first steps to take to protect societies against ransomware, and some policy recommendations thrown in there too. So Maria, over to you.
Isabella, and thanks everyone for joining this session. We're delighted that you joined, actually. Hopefully we will have an interesting discussion. Today I'm presenting a research project as part of the DAP funded by the FCDO. Some of you actually in the room participated in the interviews we conducted. So huge thanks to our advisory board, my co-authors, of course, and everyone who participated. We've done a number of interviews with stakeholders from the DAP countries, but also from the UK, US, trying to collect information around how can we prevent ransomware attacks with capacity building. And actually, as you see, we have copies in the room of the paper. You will see a long list of challenges we identified that DAP countries are facing, and stakeholders actually shared with us. But you will see also a long list of policy recommendations mechanisms, activities that policymakers can actually take to enhance national resilience. And today we are talking about national resilience, and in this session specifically for ransomware attacks. I have a very short time to actually make a summary of the paper, but I will talk about the four main themes or categories of activities we identified. And I think, Isabella, you already mentioned the first one, which is building multi-stakeholder partnerships for ransomware defense. And that would involve public, private sector, major technology partners, international actors, and that would create a community-based approach, offering incident response to those who can't afford it, for example, SMEs, forensic skills, trainings for law enforcement. But as a starting point, you will see we also classified all these recommendations based on the difficulty for implementation. So we kind of classified steps based on, categorized them as formative or up to strategic. So building on that first cluster on multi-stakeholderism, one first point of contact within law enforcement, for example, would be to establish and appoint personnel to collect and share forensic evidence with others. So basically, some basic steps of building that community and exchanging information. And as you will see, there's a lot of information of how you kind of incentivize others to share. So hopefully that is useful. But just to share a few kind of highlights from our discussions with policymakers and experts, collaboration and communication came out as one of the emerging themes in our discussions, and especially when it comes to the lack of partnerships between the public and private sector, which actually stakeholders mentioned that can diminish overall national resilience. So how do we actually work around that? How do we develop and enhance that collaboration? And of course, we've heard from others on, for example, the internal fragmentation between and among different departments within government, which again can create lack of coordination when it comes to protocols and reporting, and that can also diminish trust and confidence when it comes to cybersecurity. The second cluster, very quickly, again, looked at developing a community-based resilience architecture. And again, focusing on incident response, developing a target operation model, specific ransomware policies. But again, how do you implement this? How do you start? Actually, what is the baseline that governments can take? And as you will see in the report, we would start with identifying critical national infrastructure, key sectors, and try to identify their sensitive points. What would make them actually a target? And run exercises to actually identify and work around it. Again, bringing everyone in the room. The third cluster actually was around skills and capacity, and we've heard actually a lot about that throughout the sessions this morning, which was quite interesting. But when it comes to resilience to specific types of attacks or cybercrime overall, everyone needs to be aware. So starting from communication and training campaigns for sectors that are specifically targeted nowadays, especially in the UK and around the world. SMEs have become the target due to the lack of resources and skills and capacity. So of course, perpetrators are aware and they want the low-hanging fruit. And also developing pathways to certification. And again, promoting incentives about that, opening actually pathways and kind of facilitating for those who can actually not afford it, for example, such as SMEs. But again, promoting skills not just for the public, but for the experts. I will present examples from the UK. I've done a lot of research around skills and training for law enforcement and prosecutors, for example, and I can share the challenges that the lack of cases, cybercrime cases being prosecuted impacts the amount of training provided to prosecutors. So that ends to a kind of cycle of problematic handling of such cases. So it is a cycle, and we kind of need to break it. And lastly, defining a regulatory response to ransomware attacks. And that, again, has many steps, as you will see in the report, but starting from regulating insurance provision, cyber insurance provision, or even identifying, for example, how you can build regulation around cryptocurrency markets and try to kind of promote accountability and transparency in these markets so that you break the ability of perpetrators to monetize from their efforts. So these are the main kind of clusters. As you will see, within each one of them, we have a total of 50 recommendations, starting from basic steps up to more enhanced and advanced policy-making efforts. Key message summary, and I'm closing it, yes. Collaboration, communication. Otherwise, ransomware attacks are actually an international problem. We cannot focus only on the UK or US, develop capacity there and pretend we are resilient. It's actually a matter for everyone. So thank you very much. I hope you will enjoy reading them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Look for these blue copies of the report. They will be floating around the conference, available in different conference rooms. If you can't find a physical copy, come and find one of the conference team, or come and find KPMG, and they will make sure that you have a copy available. So thank you so much. I'd like to now turn to Chris. Chris, you have amazing experience as really the world's first cyber diplomat, now as president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, helping to lead, coordinate, adapt, and evolve an international network of partnerships for learning, capacity building in this area. I'd like to hear your reactions to some of Maria's policy recommendations, especially the idea of effective partnerships. How can you begin to build trust and incentives? How do you capitalize on an opportunity when different stakeholders may be around a table and realize that, yes, protecting societies against ransomware attacks is now top of our agenda? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'm happy to be with all of you. And I was happy to advise on the report that Isabella just talked about, which I think is quite good. So I say a couple of things. One thing is that as we look at this and we step back, ransomware is one form of cybercrime, obviously, and this has been an issue for as long as I can remember. I was a cybercrime prosecutor in the 1990s, so I'm not new to this issue. But I would say that the transformative nature of ransomware is that it's received more political attention than other kinds of cybercrime or even cyber attacks have. Now, certainly when there's nation state activity or other things that happens, people get upset about it, the governments get upset about it, but the average person doesn't really, I think, care as much about it as they do now when, for instance, in the United States, you had to stand in line for gas because of the Colonial Pipelines attack, when your healthcare could be impacted, where your business could be disrupted, and when government services can be disrupted. That has transformed what was an important issue, but not really a front burner issue in cybercrime, to one that really is top of the policy agenda, not just in the UK and the US, but really around the world. And I think that is evidenced, for instance, by the ransomware task force of 37 countries that was convened in DC just a couple of weeks ago by the Deputy National Security Advisor here. So this has become a worldwide problem, and it presents an opportunity because, there's a silver lining to bad things like this, and the silver lining is it is a wake-up call to us to go and to organize and to be much more effective in fighting these threats, and that's really where partnerships come in. Traditionally, I think there have been divisions between the technical community and the policy community, between the economic community and the security community, even between the traditional development community and the cyber capacity building community. And I think we need to get over those divisions and unify and partner with each other, public, private, tech, policy, development, cybersecurity capacity building, because this issue, I think, really is one that's not going to go away. It's not susceptible to a one-off or even 1 year or 2 year fix. It requires sustained attention, and that sustained attention means that we need to partner with each other in ways that we've thought about before, but we need to make far more effective. And I think that the report that Isabella talked about outlines some of the things that we need to do for that. We've talked about public-private partnerships for as long as I can remember. It's almost become a mantra without content. But I think in this sense, there is much more an understanding really what that means of sharing information by the government with the private sector, sector, not just sharing information, but collaborating with governments to go after this problem. And along a myriad of different avenues, everything from actually targeting some of the big ransomware actors to putting pressure on countries who provide safe havens, to really do the kind of partnerships that the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise does, which is to bring together a number of partners, civil society, private sector, and governments from around the world. We have 180 members and partners, including about 60 governments, a couple dozen companies, and civil society. And if you're not a member, it doesn't cost you anything. So I encourage you to look into that. The information is at the website is thegfc.org. So I encourage you to look at that. But obviously, one of the working groups, has been on cybercrime. There are several working groups on national strategies, on incident response, on awareness and standards, all of which goes to these issues. But cybercrime is obviously a core one. And I do think this presents us a real opportunity to move forward and to do this in a much more organized and long-term and sustained way than we have. I've been saying, cyber becomes a priority when a big thing happens for about 15 minutes and then it drops off the radar. But we can't afford that. And I think it has staying power, and ransomware is helping us do that. The one other thing I'd say is, because one of our other guests can't join us today, and I was involved in that too, about a year and a half ago, there was a mostly US-focused ransomware task force that came together with a number of recommendations, which informed the report that Isabella talked about. And that continues as well. But one part of that is to create an international working group, recognizing this really is an international problem. It's not only the big domestic people that are. I see Elizabeth is now here, so I will stop talking about Elizabeth stuff and allow Elizabeth to talk about her own stuff. But I just end on my part and saying, look, as we think about this, partnerships are vital, sustainability is vital, and capacity building is vital. And we need to keep our eye on the ball and all those things, and not let this opportunity slip away by yet again thinking, okay, the crisis has passed. With that, let me, I guess, pass it to Elizabeth, so she's here.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I won't waste any time. We're joined now by our final panelist, Elizabeth Vish, who is a senior advisor at the Institute for Security and Technology and a guiding force behind the Ransomware Task Force, which I think I'd like to turn to her to talk about now. Elizabeth, can you quickly check your sound, and can you hear us?
I can hear you quite well. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Over to you.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. It is quite early morning here, so it's a morning here for me in Colorado. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel. It was as Chris mentioned, I'm from the Institute for Security and Technology. We're a not-for-profit entity based in Silicon Valley, although with a distributed team that focuses on helping bridge the gaps between technologists and the private sector and the public sector and government and policymakers. And I am most recently a policymaker myself. I left the U.S. Department of State earlier this year and joined IST. So it's a pleasure to be with you. When I was at State Department, my portfolio included cybersecurity capacity building, as well as policy engagement with Africa. So that 3 of the DAP countries are African countries is for me a real pleasure, and it's an honor to speak with you all. I'll speak a little bit about the Ransomware Task Force And Chris was a ransomware task force co-chair, so he can bring many years of experience with it as well. But the ransomware task force was gathered in early 2021, when we were seeing, IST was seeing increasing numbers of ransomware attacks that had significant and serious national security implications. So examples of that included, the report was actually released just as the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack occurred, but we've also seen substantial increase in ransomware attacks against hospitals, including in the lead up and the first months of the pandemic. And there's also been really substantial ransomware attacks against basic infrastructure like meatpacking and educational systems. So it became a real national security threat. And so the Ransomware Task Force brought together 60 experts. Some are domestic, and some are not just in the United States, but outside of the United States as well. And the goal was really to think about, my colleague Megan likes to talk about 10% solutions that together come to be 100% improvement. So there were a variety of recommendations made in the Ransomware Task Force, many of which are really applicable to context, not just in the United States and Western Europe, but also in every nation, especially in the global South. We grouped our recommendations into 4 key themes. And I will, if Chris doesn't, I will make sure that I send a link to the Ransomware Task Force to those of you who are able to take a look at it. But the recommendations include really high-level things like make ransomware a political priority for government leaders, including continue to state publicly at the senior level that ransomware is a key concern. That's definitely something that we've seen happening. Even most recently as September, the Quad Ministerial spoke about ransomware and its importance. So that is the United States, Japan, India, and Australia all spoke about the importance of, at a political level, combating ransomware. And then there are also really practical recommendations, like provide capacity building and build a practice for addressing the use of cryptocurrencies and virtual assets in cybercrime generally, and in combating ransomware specifically. I'll talk about a few key lessons that we took away from the Ransomware Task Force, and then open it to questions. First, I'll say that the most important thing that we took away from the task force is to build the importance of building trust between private sector companies, the not-for-profit community, including the technical community, and the government, as well as building trust between different private sector entities. And that's really key for collaboration. This requires both formal and informal effort to create a legal and regulatory framework that will allow exchange of information about incidents, as well as exchange of information about threats. And really the key there is to build a two-way street where information is going back and forth on the regular. The government hears about an incident or a threat and shares that information with the private sector entities. Maybe an individual company gets attacked and can share that information with the government, who can then anonymize it and share it out with other entities in the private sector. This building collaboration can be as simple as highlighting best practices, such as the NIST ransomware framework and blueprint for ransomware defense that IST and the Center for Internet Security published in August. We have published that in Spanish, by the way, and we hope to have Portuguese later this year. Building trust can also include things like laws relating to disclosure of cybersecurity incidents. And it can include things like building up a computer emergency response team, which I know the 5 DAP countries have done, but strengthening that computer emergency response team, working on sector-based teams that can focus on just the healthcare or just the education sector, for example. And I would say that regulation has to be practical, implementable, and avoid creating perverse incentives, such as if you create an incentive that reporting will trigger a regulatory investigation, it's going to make it hard for companies to want to report if they can avoid it. So you have to really build both the practice and the regulatory framework that allows that information to be exchanged.
I'm
yes.
so sorry to interrupt. We are on a very, very tight schedule. If
Totally.
it's all right with you, I might move to questions. Is that okay? And also, please
Great.
put the information in the Zoom chat. I'll make sure that that's communicated to everyone in the room as well, so that we have access to all the resources mentioned during this short talk. In the interest of time, I'd like to take 3 questions at once. If you could briefly introduce your name, your affiliation, your organization, and very, very quickly your question. Any first takers? Okay, fantastic. Are there any, and maybe another couple of questions? I might take 3 at once and then pose them to all 3 panelists. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Can people online hear me?
Speak a little louder.
Can you hear me online or not?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Chris from the Home Office Cyber Policy Unit. Previously was DAP lead for Indonesia, so I have double affiliation to this. But I wanted to ask a bit about payments. So one of the big issues that comes up internationally with this topic is the fundamental question of whether an organisation pays the ransom. It's not illegal in the UK to pay the ransom, but it's strongly discouraged. There are some countries considering making it illegal to pay ransoms. Some organisations feel trapped, and there's some research suggests that making it illegal just means you have less reporting, basically. So we haven't yet come to a final position on that in the UK. I wanted to know sort of early thoughts, or even perhaps from the research paper, having not read it. Are you steering countries towards a certain position on that? Maybe for Maria?
Yeah, could I hand over to Maria, and then if Chris and Elizabeth have any comments on that, then I'll hand over to them after, and then we can hopefully take another round of questions.
Yes, so as you already said, the UK advises against paying ransom. We've seen cases that law enforcement actually supported paying ransom when, depending on the criticality of data, I would say. But during our interviews, mainly the discussion was around more reporting rather than legislating cryptocurrency markets, to be honest. So it is a consideration, yes. But I would like to hear actually in the room, if we have time at the end, how could this happen within the DAP countries or in abroad. But yeah, in the UK, I think, definitely the focus is on discouraging payments, certainly.
Yeah, so let me follow up on that. First, give my regards to Chloe at the Home Office. Second, look, I think this is one of the things that the ransomware task force I talked about that Elizabeth is now on, and I co-chaired, we struggled with. It was one recommendation we couldn't reach consensus on, because on the one hand, as you say, banning payments could drive reporting underground, and could also, hurt the victims more, especially small and medium-sized businesses or local governments. On the other hand, the reason that these ransomware actors do this is for money. So, there is some logic to doing it. And where we ended up was saying you need to have a glide path to get there. In other words, you may think about banning payments, but you need to make sure that you have some things in place so that potential victims are prepared. There needs to be some support that governments give them in terms of resources of where they call and how they deal with this, and maybe even a fund that helps them deal with some of the ransomware damage, especially if they're a small business or say a hospital. So it's not a black and white issue. Now, I also know that a number of countries, and even I think this came up in the White House led ransomware task force that I mentioned, international task force, this continues to be an issue. And I think it's a hard issue, but I think over time that probably is the right solution. However, there's a glide path to get there, and we're not there yet.
Elizabeth, can I hand over to you for some final comments? And if everybody is all right with it, we could maybe do one more round of questions if there's any in the room, taking us to 2:04, maybe 2:03. Elizabeth.
The only other thing I'll say about paying ransom is that sometimes entities that request ransom are sanctioned entities. And so whether or not you have banned ransomware payments as a general matter, if you're paying a ransom to an entity that is under US sanctions, then that is prohibited by US law. So definitely, I don't think there have been any cases where the US has gone after ransomware payers, but it is a thing to flag. These are really bad guys, and giving them money is real bad. Yeah, thanks.
That's exactly the summary we needed. Are there any final questions from the room? Do we have anyone? Was that Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Mine is just a quick one. There was a comment about, or rather this is what it said, cyber becomes a strategy when something happens for 15 minutes, and then we get back to default settings. What would be your recommendation on how to sustain this to an ongoing conversation and not make it a risk that is just discussed when it happens and then it dies off? What are the recommendations on how that can be sustained, especially within a government setting?
I think you need to mainstream this as a priority, and particularly as a political priority. And I think that, in fact, ransomware has helped do that because, as I said, ordinary people see this and that transforms it into a political priority. Ordinary people don't really care that a government stealing information from another government. It's a big deal, but it's done to the governments, but it doesn't matter to the ordinary person. So the way you mainstream it, I think, is make it more of, a realistic priority. When you have business disruption, government disruption, that helps governments understand, even like senior ministers or presidents or prime ministers who maybe are scared of cyber because they think it's too technical. This puts it back into like terms that they understand, and you can translate to them in terms they can understand. Look, people in government deal with very complex issues all the time. They should be able to deal with cyber issues too. And I think we're reaching the point where that's happening. So my advice is tie it to what they're actually seeing, some of the real harms that are going on, and don't explain it in technical terms, explain it in terms that policymakers get. And I think that will help transform this.
Elizabeth?
I'll add that I think the one place that you can turn for assistance is the private sector. So government entities may not see the cyber attacks that even are occurring on their own networks, but a lot of the multinational companies that are located in DAP countries have a lot of visibility. They have visibility in attacks that have happened on them. They have visibility on attacks that have happened globally to their counterparts. And so if government is open to having a conversation with the entire multi-stakeholder community, that can help them understand the stakes and the costs. I was at the Paris Peace Forum also with Chris a couple of weeks ago, and one of the major companies that had been seriously impacted by NotPetya said, we had to completely revamp our cybersecurity because we saw just how incredibly devastating it was. And we're now ready to talk to our partners about what they can do and how they can take action. And so this is a place where really, it's not a government problem to solve by itself. It's a problem for the private sector, the technical community, and government to come together to talk about. But to do that, you have to build an open conversation between the government and non-government stakeholders. And so government really has to be willing to have those conversations. And sometimes the private sector can help kick that off, but there has to be trust built.
Thank you so much. And for a final comment, Maria.
Thank you. Yes, so I think we all agree, you heard from Chris and Elizabeth, all about trust and collaboration. So there are definitely policy making decisions and actions that need to be made. But let's not forget that most ransomware attacks took place due to a social engineering incident. So we have to also take care of basic cybersecurity hygiene. So education, awareness, basic steps to actually protect society and citizens. Thank you.
That's a fantastic note to end on. If you could join me in thanking our panel.